Welcome to Theological Grazing.
This past year, I read a lot of the German philosopher Josef Pieper, and I was really struck by so much of what he had to say. I mean, really incredible, but especially his work on feasting. He has a book called In Tune with the World, and it's this whole kind of philosophy of festivity. And how do you have festivity and feasting? And I think this is massive. I think it's key for so much of what is needed today, whether we're talking about culturally, whether we're talking about in the church, even just in homes. I think we have just completely lost the whole idea of festivity. And I think this affects us. So as Christians, I think this affects us. For instance, in our view of things like the Sabbath, like the Lord's Day. And it's so hard for us to understand why God would make a Sabbath. And it's so hard even for those who understand, yes, like God does still require a Sabbath for his people, a day set aside for worship and rest. And it's so hard for people to understand that and see it and get it without it just becoming this rigorous, legalistic kind of a deal, because I think that we're missing this piece. We're missing any concept really of festivity and of this kind of archetypal leisure time that is a feast. Feasting has just been common through human history, and it still is kind of a thing, although I really think that it's mostly missing in the kind of post-Christian West. And Pieper actually talks about this, and the reason for this being, he quotes, I can't remember if he's quoting who he quotes. I think it's either Plato or Aristotle, if I'm recalling right, even with those options. But one of these two, I think it's Aristotle, but don't hold me to that. Because even now that I said it, now I'm like, well, actually, maybe I'm exactly wrong. But either way, one of these men, one of these great philosophers of the past, had something to say like, there is no festivity without the gods, or there is no feasting without the gods. Now, Pieper is a Christian, and he uses this to speak of the fact that, you know, apart from God, there is no possibility of feasting. And that's because feasting is inherently a celebration, a festival of gratitude, and it has to be directed somewhere. And in order for it to be a true feast, because a feast is, again, a kind of archetypal leisure time, it has to be something that is directed outside of us. It has to be directed towards something greater and bigger and beyond. It has to be directed toward the higher things. And that simply can't be unless you have God, unless God's in the picture. Now, it's so fascinating. What hit me most about this is how we live in a time where, you know, everyone is constantly trying to make holidays, that is to say, holy days. But they're constantly trying to make feast days, in other words. They're trying to take the calendar and turn everything into a new kind of feast day, celebrating whatever modern sentiment it might be. And it just doesn't work. You don't have the unified feasting of people across the board. You don't have the joy and celebration that you have, for instance, at things like Christmas. Even this seems to be dying slowly. The closest thing I can think of a somewhat more modern creation of a holiday would be Thanksgiving. But even Thanksgiving, right? This is a celebration of gratitude directed at God. That's what it originally was anyway, right? That's what it's supposed to be. But when you think about some of the primary feast days, really they're centered around Christ. You think of Christmas and Easter. They're centered around, days that are in a sense gone with Christendom. As far as a societal institution, we still celebrate them, but they are not quite what they have been, at least not on a cultural level. I think for a lot of us, probably a lot of you listening to this, these are still fantastic celebrations. But that's because they're centered around God, because they're centered around Christ. But apart from that, apart from having that, you actually can't have true, full celebration. And you cannot have a true feast. With a feast, you have to have a certain sense of gratitude, but you also have to have a certain sense of, none of this matters, right? The cost of the feast, the amount of work that goes into it, it has to be seen as this doesn't matter because it's being done toward the end of something that is higher and greater. It can be lavish. It can be extreme because it's far beyond just here and now. Right? You're not counting pennies when you're getting ready for a feast. No, you're trying to make it lavish. Because it's a big deal. It's a celebration. Right? It's not let's see what we can get for the cheapest price. It's, hey, where's our best stuff? Right? Where's our best food? Where's the best wine? Let's pull all of that out. But again, these sorts of things are good and right and necessary. I think we're missing it in many ways, but it cannot be done apart from actually having that higher aim, apart from that thankfulness of heart that overflows into joyous celebration, which can only come if it's directed toward God. Well, that's all, folks. If you could help me out, rate and review this podcast, share it with a friend, go ahead and email me if you have any questions. We're out.